Hello, everybody, and good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today. We're just waiting a few moments as guests are still joining us online. As you will be aware, this is our first hybrid event of this type in the university for a while, so it's really excellent to have you all here. We're using a Zoom webinar platform today. So for those of you joining us from around the world, you don't need to worry about being on camera, but for information, today's talk will be recorded for the university's YouTube channel. So if you need to leave early for any reason, you can catch up later or share with your friends or colleagues. I'm just going to take a moment to remind you to put your phone on silent. We haven't been in person for a while, so we've got out of the habit potentially. So hopefully mine is on silent and we're all ready. Now, before I hand over to Emanuelle, I just wanted to remind us all that we're going to have an opportunity for questions at the end of today's session. There are people who are here in person will be able to present their questions, and we have a roving mic. And some colleagues have submitted questions prior to the event. But please don't worry if you haven't submitted your question prior to the event. If you're on the Zoom webinar, then you can ask a question using the Q&A functionality at the bottom of your screen. You do that by hovering over the bottom of your screen for the Q&A icon to appear. But please note that Q&A is not the same as chat. If you put a question in chat, it won't be submitted to us, and therefore we won't get a chance to answer it later. You can use the chat area for general comments, for feedback, or for thoughts throughout and at the end of the presentation. But don't worry about remembering how to do all of this. I'll try and remind you whenever we get to that part of the event. So, to my introduction, it gives me really great pleasure to welcome everybody here today. My name is Andrea Nelson, and I'm the Pro Vice Chancellor for Research here at Glasgow Caledonian University. Not only is it a pleasure to see people from across the university community, but also to welcome via our hybrid technology today a network of people from across the globe whose work is also interdisciplinary and spans the many domains analogous to Emanuelle's work, which spans sociology, health, and very many personal domains as well, as we'll see in the presentation. I'm looking forward to hearing Emanuelle tell us more about her work on the sociology of ageing and sport, and that's work which has emerged from her initial interest in the sociology of the body, and now is more refined into this work on ageing and physical activity. I think we can all agree that we will have some personal interest in that, given that we cannot reverse the ageing process as yet, and we continue to be active if we're blessed. So we each have some skin in this game. Emanuelle will take us on a journey, not only through her work, but also bringing a personal reflection, making links between theory, practice, research, and the very many contexts in which these are set. But it would be wrong of me not to also note that in this inaugural professorial lecture, it's also a formal opportunity for us to welcome Professor Tulle to the Academy as a full professor and to say our congratulations on that. But without taking any more of your precious time, Emanuelle, can I welcome you to give your professorial lecture? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for coming. I feel slightly overwhelmed. Professorial lecture. So I became a professor actually 3.5 years ago. So as one of my colleagues said recently, well, I should have been writing this 3.5 years ago, but I didn't. I wrote it fairly recently, and I have a big bundle of index cards, so I don't think I'll be going through all of these in about 30 minutes for to outline very quickly the work that I've been doing the last 27 years, and then some personal reflections, as Andrea has already signposted. And although the lecture has a physical activity theme, I don't propose to actually deliver a lecture on physical activity. I don't have PowerPoint slides. So I'm just going to grace you with some pictures, which I picked. There wasn't really a particular method for picking these pictures. There's a lot of mountains and there's a lot of snow, but I do walk in summer as well. Actually, my interest in physical activity was a byproduct of earlier work that I had done. So I stumbled upon physical activity in the same way that I stumbled upon much of the work that I developed, particularly at the start of my career, which just goes to show that we don't always have a best laid plan when we do research. It's often a process of development and sometimes serendipity as well. But certainly some of the ideas that I've had over the years and that I've proposed in a series of journal articles, a book and so on, have been really part of a process of slow development, trickling and percolation. So what I want to do today is to focus mostly on what I think I have contributed to the sociology of aging, and how sport and later physical activity have helped me contribute to the emergence of a new subdiscipline of what we call social gerontology, or the study of aging, but from a social perspective. This new subdiscipline is cultural gerontology. And this has taken place because I developed an interest in the lived experience of aging by focusing more specifically on the body. So what I'm proposing to do is to use a concept developed by Michel Foucault, who's a French, was a French philosopher, genealogy of my work. And in the process, I hope that I can invite all of us to reframe the problem of particularly low physical activity participation, not just as a kind of a panicked response to a public health emergency, but actually as a reconnection with our bodies and our embodiment. So I have been at GCU for 26.5 years. But I've been an academic since 1991, and I've been doing quite a lot of empirical work in that time, as well as carrying a teaching load, especially here. I've done work not exclusively in sport and physical activity, although they have been central. This particular focus has been central to my work. So I've done work with master runners, with elite athletes. I didn't meet Roger Federer or when I wrote about him, but I did some work commenting on how his aging was represented in the media. I've done work with people who are not who do not have a history of regular physical activity, older adults without physical activity participation. I've done work with perimenopausal women, and this is work which I still have to analyze. And I've done work with women mountaineers. So all these have a sport physical activity dimension and focus on the later years. But I have other notable projects, including a project funded in part by Strava, with John McKendrick and James Bowness, and of course all sorts of other bits and pieces of work. But I'd like to mention a project which I conducted with Elizabeth Mooney here on housing decisions in later life, which actually drew my attention to the salience of looking at aging embodiment when we think about aging. But I've also done other work. For instance, I've looked at users in the criminal justice system when I was at Stirling University, young carers, conducted a study in Castlemilk looking at well-being, and did some work in dual diagnosis and so on. So I've quite an eclectic, but with a central focus. Now, what I've been doing in the last 25 years really is to seek to challenge what I would call the dominant discourse of aging and old age. So for those of you who are not familiar with the concept of discourse from a philosophical and sociological perspective, this refers to the system of ideas, institutions, and practices which shape how we understand the world, which enable us to ask questions about the world, but also to imagine solutions. This is a kind of homemade definition, by the way. Now, the dominant discourse of aging and old age in the West is a discourse of inevitable decline, which is fueled largely by biomedicine or modern medicine as it emerged in the 19th century. So this is what provides us with a framework within which we largely make sense of the later years. And as Stephen Katz in Canada has showed, this way of framing aging and aging bodies as in decline has informed how old age has been constructed as an intractable problem, and it has also informed how we've managed older adults. And have we made sense of older adults as a burden, not amenable to any kind of improvement, with disease as expected and little cultural value? So what I'm best known for, I would say, and I'm a little bit coy about making those kinds of claims, but sometimes as a woman academic, we have to make them. We have to own this. What I'm best known for is actually focusing on aging bodies to try and challenge this discourse of the dominant discourse of aging and old age. And this has been enabled, as it were, by turning to philosophy. So what I've done is I've borrowed concepts and theories from disciplines outside of social gerontology more widely, to try and inject new life and to give me new ideas, try and open up how we talk about aging and old age. And so I think it's important to remind ourselves that what underpins the dominant discourse of aging and old age is what we call mind-body dualism or Cartesian dualism, which is the foundation of much Western thinking and informs how we make sense of bodies, generally speaking. So the mind would be constitutive of our humanness. This is what makes us, this is the seat of our rational being, and the body would be the animal part of us, but also external and subordinate to the rest of us. So the body is an object, and therefore we're vulnerable to various forms of objectification. And I know that I've got feminist criminologists and sociologists in the room, and they will understand that well. So some people are at greater risk of being objectified, that is, reduced to their bodies and thus considered less valuable, less civilized, and also less controllable because they have uncontrollable physiology, and aging bodies are particularly at risk of this. So this has two consequences. Personal and in terms of the management of populations. First of all, we lose contact with our bodies as more generally speaking, but specifically when we get older, and we're prone to treating bodies as other, as alien, particularly aging bodies. And it also has another consequence, which is to facilitate the emergence and development of structures of dependency, not as individual dependency, but as institutional dependency. In other words, we make the old dependent on various kinds of institutions, and we become dependent on others for knowledge and truth about aging bodies. Yet we cannot be in the world without our bodies, so we need them, and they give us access to knowledge of the world and of our place within it. And here I would have been influenced by the work of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who's a phenomenologist and who made that particular case for a reconnection of body and mind to make sense of our place in the world and to understand our place in the world. So a few questions have been asked and very little curiosity has been shown about how we live in and within our bodies, especially as we age. There are lots of pronouncements about what it's like to be old, but actually we've never really asked people themselves. So we have had, until fairly recently, things have changed, a fairly partial understanding of the experience of, or rather experiences of aging, because there isn't just one unitary experience of it. So there are a range of questions that I think we could ask about aging bodies, and which have a kind of existential dimension. The first one is, what does it feel like to age? When I got into this area of work, people weren't asked and we didn't really know. We made assumptions, but we didn't really know. What is our orientation to our bodies when we age, and how does that change as we become old? What are our sources of knowledge about our bodies? How do we manage bodies as they age, especially in a cultural environment which largely discourages visible aging and gives value to youthful appearance? How can we retain relevance in a cultural context that devalues old age? So these are, I think, they're both existential concerns, but also cultural concerns. So I'm beginning to make some links outside of the discipline, as it were. So I decided to focus on bodily aging and aged embodiment. That is how bodies are put into motion and how we actually understand these bodies. And so how did I do that? So I remember when I was thinking about doing a piece of work on aging embodiment, I was looking in the literature for examples of research that would deal with those kinds of concerns, and I couldn't really find anything. I found one reference which bemoaned actually the inability of older adults to talk about their bodies outside of a medical framework. So they talked about their aging bodies but as sick bodies, but they didn't have a language, or they didn't give themselves permission to talk about their bodies in other ways. So I had to try and find ways of unlocking talk of the body. And as it happens, I'm a runner, ish, and not much of a runner these days, I have to say. But it occurred to me that, at the time I was in my mid-30s, so I was a master runner, as I realized one day when I took part in a race and there was a big cross on my number, and I wondered what it meant. It meant I was a veteran runner. And I thought, well, runners, they must know about their bodies, particularly veteran runners. So I'll go and ask them. So that's how it kind of started, And then I thought, right, how am I going to do that? How am I going to ask them about their bodies? So I decided to focus actually on their running careers, or as I ended up calling them, careers, even though they weren't professional runners. And it seemed a good idea to access experiences of the body by looking back over time and asking people if they'd noticed any changes. So I recreated individual biographies, asking people to do this from the vantage point of the present and focusing on their activities, their running, their training, and so on. And so, interestingly enough, it gave me access to biographies, but it gave me access to a range of other interesting things. In particular, it gave me access to the structural and historical forces which intersected with these biographies and gave them shape then and now. So in other words, what sorts of biographical disruptions, distortions, and continuities had taken place were visible through the way that people recreated their own running biographies. And I think that gave people, the people I interviewed, a language and a framework to talk about their bodies now and in the past. So as well as being a sociologist, I'm looking at my history colleagues with slight trepidation. I kind of became a historian of running. And later, when I started doing work in mountaineering, of sports medicine, I had to read some sports medicine. It was very interesting and maddening in equal measure, of working class physicality and so on. But what this also gave me access to, therefore, is temporalities of aging. We age in time, obviously, we go through time, but also we catch time at a particular point in time. And then, of course, when it comes to things like running or other forms of physical activity, these things take time to embed and undertake, which in itself can be interesting. So just quickly, my runners, so they're my runners. I interviewed them 20 years ago or 22 years ago, but they're still, for me, it was as if it was like yesterday. And, so I interviewed runners who had been running for at least 15 years because I wanted to get a sense of change. I wanted them to have a sense of change in their performance, which meant that, of course, so that was 2000, I couldn't find any women, or not very many women who fulfilled my criteria. That's why I had to go and read a history of the marathon and of women running and athletics. So that was really the trigger to become a part-time historian. And a range of things came up. First of all, the amount of training these people did was insane. They ran 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 miles a week. And they were in their 50s and upwards. The women were slightly younger. And of course, they were survivors. A lot of them had fallen by the wayside. So the ones that I didn't interview had fallen by the wayside because of illness, injury, death. Or the weight of family obligations. But a few things happened in the course of their lives that enabled them to be runners or to become runners and remain runners. Because I think when we talk about sport and physical activity, it's not something that is, it's something that's in process and takes a long time. This is where, by focusing on the body, that I really understood that it takes a long time to change the body and bed in the urge to run. So they got the urge to run, but this was facilitated by a range of intersecting issues. For instance, an invention, I guess, of city marathons in the 1980s, which gave a lot of people a new lease of life if their running had started flagging, or gave them, particularly for the women, the permission to start running. Key figures as well, public figures like Catherine Switzer, some of you may have heard of her. She's an American runner, and she tried to run the Boston Marathon and was almost removed from the course. And that was in the 1970s because women were not allowed to run marathons. And for those of you who don't know, the first Olympic marathon for women was in 1984 in LA. Before that, women were not allowed to run long distance since 1928. So various figures, various events, and for the runners as well, for instance, the Masters movement, as they turned 40, when they might have been expected to retire, they discovered the Masters movement, which gave them which enable them to continue running and to continue training. And at the same time, a transformation in training methods, which some of them actually ran less but better. And so they were able to continue running into their 50s, 60s, and 70s. After that, it becomes a bit difficult. But they all had health problems, heart problems, Parkinson's. One guy I interviewed had 2 heart attacks by the time I had finished writing up my PhD. So they weren't necessarily that healthy, but they certainly felt they were. I want to talk about the women mountaineers. This is a more recent piece of work, and it didn't start as a study of aging mountaineers. It started as an interrogation of performativity, that is, whether women mountaineers challenge hypermasculinity in the mountains. Actually, I ended up interviewing a few of the older mountaineers that are mostly members of the Ladies Scottish Climbing Club, and they also gave me access to a range of considerations, the realization that we need to look at intersecting events to understand how these women manage to break through the gender barriers and also the class barriers, because mountaineering in the early 20th century, or actually at its inception, was really an activity for the privileged few. But what was really interesting about these women is that, and this is something that I realized as well about my own experience of being in mountains, is that we often owe our being in mountains to men, but also to particular policies, public policies, which opened up the outdoors to a wider public. So these women have also become mountaineers. So this is a source of identity for them. And they have aged into mountains. So again, they are survivors. And but what's interesting about some of them is that instead of going vertical as they age, they start going horizontal. So that, I think, is an interesting insight about how the aging body changes how we operate, how we move around in the world. So it's a question of identity. And people would say things like, I'm outdoorsy. So I would ask, how did you start being mountaineer? I'm outdoorsy, I'm a mountaineer, I'm a hill walker, I'm a runner. So the practice confers legitimacy. However, this is set against, and here I can talk about the people that I interviewed who didn't have a history of physical activity, but had been encouraged to be physically active because of quite substantial health problems. And when we asked the women in particular if they did any kind of physical activity in the past, they said, no, I'm not sporty. So there's this nice conflation of sport and physical activity, which means that actually physical activity becomes alien to people. And the I'm not sporty claim relates to this notion that you have to have some sort of innate talent for it to be able to undertake it. So physical activity is equated almost with elite physicality. So being outdoorsy is something that you own, that belongs to you even before you get started. So, which is quite depressing, because it means that for a lot of people, there is no sense that they could take part in any kind of physical a transformation of their physicality because they feel intimidated by sport or by physical activity as sport. I think also, I've already alluded to that, but aging is mediated by larger processes, so policy choices and structural forces. Making the outdoors attainable, as I've already said, the invention of the outdoors as a place of leisure was an explicit policy that we encounter in France, in Britain, and so on. So, for instance, in France, this was facilitated by the introduction of paid holidays between the First and Second World War, an investment in community type sports, for instance, having tennis courts in villages and so on, a big building program, for instance, for ski resorts, and I am a beneficiary of that. I started skiing at the age of 5, thanks to this process of what we might call industrialization of mountain sports. And then a range of training programs to unskill people, although it wasn't terribly child-friendly, I can tell you. In contemporary Britain, it was, for instance, Outward Bound was a really important structure which enabled people who didn't have a history of mountaineering, didn't come from mountaineering families, and came from aspirational families to start to encounter the outdoors in a more adventurous way. But of course, all this is very fragile. We know, for instance, that the austerity ideology that's been prevalent since at least 2010, enthralled to neoliberal economics, has led to the erosion of public funding for all manners of public goods. Most of the funding for sports has been channeled into elite sports for national or perhaps nationalist glorification and also commercial interests. And there has been absolutely no evidence of the promise trickled down to grassroots sports or physical activity in the wake, for instance, of London 2012. And there has been also a catastrophic and disempowerment and erosion of local authority funding, which is now inadequate and has led to the closure of many, or the stopping many leisure activities for local populations, with a shift to the private and third sector for providing physical activity services. Just like to say before I move on, I talked about structures earlier on and policy. I think it's important to remember that class and gender are really important factors which influence the extent to which we will become physically active and remain physically active. Pierre Bourdieu, another French sociologist, argued that we become aware, we are socialized into our social location, our class position, but also our gender through the body. So we internalize these things through the process of socialization early on, and this creates our dispositions. That is our probability that we will have a taste or a willingness for doing particular kinds of activities. So class has been important for mountaineering, for instance, as I've already said, and we also see class playing out in the history of running, with long distance being particularly for American history of running, with long distance being the reserve of working class migrants, and athletics being the preserve of the elite. Generally speaking, we know that sport is class-bound. This is nothing new, but it has a real impact on how people imagine putting their own bodies in movement. Gender is also really important. I've already alluded to it. One of the women or 2 or 3 of the women we spoke to talked about sweating. Sweating for working class women was a real problem. Women were brought up when respectable working class women did not sweat, and now we're asking them to sweat. And this is, they're having to retrain their brains to actually normalize sweating, that sweating is a good thing, because as part of their labor of distinction, class distinction, status distinction, they wanted to distance themselves from laboring physicality, or on the other hand, self-indulgent care of the body and self. So, and to an extent, this is still relevant. So I think we need to bear that in mind. These things have a long-term impact, not just in our own biographies, but the biographies of people who succeed us. And that's what I call the weight of history, is that these class and policy and gender processes affect us today, but they can affect others further down the line, as it were. So we might say to people, you need to be physically active now, but what they have been socialized into was informed by their parents and their parents before them, and will continue to influence them. So I think we need, when we start thinking about how to encourage people to be physically active, then we need to start thinking about this long range impact that our ideas have. Because ultimately what happens is that people feel like fish out of water if they're encouraged to be physically active. They find themselves, I mean, I feel, for instance, quite intimidated. I do occasionally go climbing. I go to a climbing wall in Glasgow or in Edinburgh. I feel quite spooked, by all this gear and that chalk and the weird gear that some of these men wear, and shorts when it's very cold. And so the weight of history is also manifested in how, through our bodies, we feel comfort or discomfort in particular settings, what Pierre Bourdieu called social fields. I will just say, to finish this part of the lecture that deals with my work, that I did talk about physical activity, didn't I? And I did because a few years ago, physical activity as a route to health and as prevention of ill health, and in particular, many of the decrements of aging has been discovered, rediscovered, reframed, and so on. And so it could be hoped that this would provide, for instance, one of those turning points, those biographical disruptors that would encourage people to take up physical activity, because we see it as a public health. We see problems of sedentary behavior, as it's called, as a public health emergency. And it's also a way of addressing what Stephen Katz called alarmist demography, that is the fear of population aging. But what it does is that it's also resonated with issues around individual responsibility, that is leaving aside the structural features which prevent people from putting their bodies into movement and connecting with their bodies, and focusing more specifically on normative injunctions to be physically active and to change behavior, when in fact, it's not just a question of the individual. So just to, as I said, to finish this part of the talk, I'd just like to propose that we rethink physical activity, not just, or for instance, people who are physically active late into life, not as heroes of aging. To an extent, they're lucky. They've been lucky with their physicality, perhaps their genetic baggage, but also they've been lucky that their lives have intersected with a range of influences which have facilitated a long career in whatever physical endeavor they alighted on. But I think and to trying to bring physical activity to a wider recognition, I think we should see it as a practice of freedom, especially for women. The freedom to roam at will, wherever, the freedom to be at ease in our bodies, and the freedom to seek pleasure from putting the body in movement and acquiring lovely skills that enable you to go, for instance, ski touring in the Cairngorms on a sunny day, with or without men. By the same token, I think we need to embrace quietness, rest, immobility, and doing nothing at all, for those who prefer it or for those who can no longer move, so that they're not culturally rejected. We need to restore funding to local authorities and to all these wonderful developments and initiatives that can be biographical disruptors. And of course, we need to address male violence and white privilege in public spaces, which continue to exclude many people. And of course, also the issue of youthfulness, the focus on youthfulness. So now I want to start talking about myself because it is my prerogative. And you know, my colleagues here will know that I hate to talk about myself. What this work has enabled me to do in the last few years is actually reflect on my own practice, on my own life, and at the same time that has fed back into my work. So there's been a lovely interaction. So I do recommend sometimes using your own personal experiences as a field of research, although you have to be careful with that as well, that you don't become sick of the whole thing. Leisure has to remain leisure. You can't be on duty the whole time. But certainly if I think about my own life, as a runner, mountaineer, and it's taken me a long time to own that concept, that identity of mountaineering. I swim. I'm really physically active. It's ridiculous, and I have a full-time job and a family and so on. But one of the things that I think has been really has been eye-opening for me is to look at, as a woman, the impact that men have had on my life, and in particular my life as a woman who engages in sports and leisure. So now what we need is to have more women who actually act as gatekeepers for other women, and more older adults who act as gatekeepers for older adults. But it requires also time, as I've already said, but also financial capital, and a continuation of Scotland's outdoor access legislation, so we can continue to roam, and organisations such as the Ladies Scottish Climbing Club, but also Mountaineering Scotland, the Ramblers, and so on. And in terms of running, all the other organisations that provide running, such as Part Run, to make sure that people have a go, like I have, at a change of identity, or rather the development of an identity as an active person. But it takes time. I've mentioned this already. The labour of bodily maintenance is insane, especially as I get older. I spend a lot of time in gyms to restore muscle mass post-menopause. And yes, I will mention the menopause. And just to be able to continue what I would like to do, but with some adjustments. So I think that's also a salutary lesson. One day I thanked my mum for supporting me financially through my studies, particularly higher education. And she replied that, in fact, the gratitude should go to myself, because I'd funded much of my own higher education. I did a degree in English and American literature in the French University in Nanterre. But after that, my OU degree, my MSc, and all the way to my PhD, I guess I did myself and paid for it myself, although with some thanks from Glasgow Caledonian University and my department in particular. So I thought my mum was very perspicacious, and I was really proud of her. But actually, we never achieve anything on our own. So in the same way that we're mostly not inherently sporty or outdoorsy, but that we develop a disposition for sport or the outdoors, so do we with our professional careers. We also need a good dose of luck and serendipity. And there was little in my family at first which predisposed me to a career in academia, and the ambition that propelled me to apply for promotion from about 2007, I think. So from lecturer to senior lecturer and so on. I did indeed come from a working class family. I know people say these things, but it's true. My maternal grandfather didn't have a trade. He was an unskilled manual worker who was a member of the Communist Party. He was opinionated, quick to critique, and associated people who sat down to work with the bourgeoisie. So there you go. My grandmother was married twice. She made bags with beads and brought up 5 children, 5 surviving children, including my mother. And they experienced substantial personal tragedies, which went on to affect my own personality, despite the fact that many of these tragedies, or one in particular, took place long before I was born. My grandfather told my mom that he would support her through college and even university if she wanted. She was born in 1937, and she said no. But for some reason, there was something in that family. We used to watch movies on this program called Les Dossiers de l'Écran. I had to Google that. I couldn't remember the title. And so once a month, I think they showed movies in that program. And then there was a panel of guests, and they commented on the movies. So we watched them, most of them war movies, of course. And we used to heckle at the TV. I think some of you know that I still heckle. But there was one particular turning point. My mother married a guy who was doing his PhD. He was finishing his PhD in physics, plasma physics, when I was 8.5. He had a scholarship at the CEA, the Atomic Energy Agency, where she worked as a secretary. She typed his PhD thesis during May 1968, and I went to his viva, or the public defense. Understood nothing, of course, but I'd gone to a viva. And talking about May 68, these were heady days. I spent a lot of time outside, and the weather was fantastic. We didn't go to school, but it led to the broadening of higher education, and I benefited from that. I wasn't a straight A pupil, but for some reason, I developed intellectual ambitions. And I guess the major disruption to my life was coming to Scotland. Well, there were a few others that I'm skating over, but I discovered the Open University, the social sciences, although I'd studied philosophy at school. And that led to the feeling that I could recognize myself as an academic. And I think I am the only professor in my family, although not the only PhD, obviously. To finish, I'd like to mention some people, some of whom are not here, don't even know I'm going to mention them. I'd like to thank my secondary school maths teacher who predicted that because I wasn't very good at maths, I wouldn't achieve much more than being a trilingual secretary. That was in 1975. I did become a secretary, so she was almost right, not trilingual, still struggle with German. I would also like to thank remember Jean-Michel Desprats, who was one of my lecturers at Nanterre. And he was also a translator of Shakespeare plays. And in my last year at university, he ran a module which was to put together a representation of Under Milkwood, the radio play by Dylan Thomas. But we actually performed it on stage. It was hard. I was pretty self-conscious, but I did manage to do a good job, including sing a cappella in front of lots of people. And I developed a taste for performance, surely. My friend Moira McCullough, who introduced me to the OU, she was doing an OU degree in gender studies, and I thought, oh, it's not just maths or computing, because my husband at the time was doing a maths OU degree, an OU maths degree. And David McQueen at Edinburgh University, who enabled me to transition from a secretarial post to a more research-focused post. And so the OU and McQueen together led me to my first research post at Stirling. Bill Hughes, with whom I had chats about Michel Foucault, whom I actually tried to read in French, my native language, and couldn't understand. So we had some good chats about this, so thank you, Bill. Rachel Russell, who one day said to me, It's so easy to work with you, Emanuelle. I can give you more teaching and you never complain. You always say yes. Thank you for not exploiting that. Victoria and Palmer and James Bores, who were my PhD students and became collaborators and are now great friends. Cassie Phoenix, I don't know if you're on Zoom, but our discussions on aging embodiment and physical activity have been transformative. All who invited me as speakers and visiting fellows in various parts of the world, around Europe, as far as Australia and British Columbia. And my social science colleagues, especially, I would say, our early careers colleagues who are not here, are not all here, but you have to take on a fair amount of the administrative burden of running a degree, and thus leaving senior staff the ability to do a bit more research. I think it's the wrong way around, and I hope that we'll be able to recruit more colleagues so that we can spread the admin load more fairly and give those colleagues the ability to develop their own research career. And then lastly, my parents, obviously. Sam, if you're listening, thank you. With Shannon, you've produced a grandson. So we now have 4 generations. That's wonderful. So thank you to you and Shannon. And of course, Stephen Farmer, I know you're there. Stephen, you hate sports. You hate walking uphill and you hate snow, and yet you live in Switzerland. Don't get this. Stephen loves being sedentary, and he puts me to shame with his avid reading. He has supported me over the last 20 years, through many tricky life events and through my PhD, by providing, and he continues to do so, love, affection, and when we're together, cooking. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emanuelle. That was excellent. And we've got a number of questions which have been received in Zoom. First of all, are there any questions from here today? We've got a roving mic. And while you're thinking of your question, perhaps, Emanuelle, you could answer this question in terms of the best way to reach out to older people to get them involved in exercise has come from Nicola Campbell.
Well, I think that there's not one best way. There are myriads of ways. We need to have I think I used this on Radio Scotland one day, a panoply of initiatives, but we need to, so that's why we've got to reverse the erosion in public funding. We need to find lots of ways to grab people, but also, although I love sports, I do recognize that the blurred boundary between sport and physicality can be really off-putting for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So, we need to, and that's why I suggested that we frame this as a practice of freedom rather than a public health practice, for instance. Now, that might work for people, but when I was studying the runners and even the women mountaineers, these people do not do what they do for health. The fact that it's good for their health, maybe, is a happy byproduct of their activities. So, so we need, and so some people might be drawn in because of the health benefits of engaging in active physicality. but then we need to take them through to the next level. And one of the sources of disappointment that I experienced a few years ago was when I was doing the research with the men and women who were not physically active and who attended an exercise class to take them beyond, let's say, cardiac rehab, you know, the first sessions of cardiac rehab. They were really enjoying what they were doing, but the class was discontinued and they were expected to then rejoin the main gym. And there was no way most of these people were going to do that. For one thing, they hated the music, and I have to say I agreed with them. It was too loud, it was the wrong kind of music for them, but also it was intimidating. They felt like fish out of water, irrespective of the extent to which their bodies could withstand.
Right. So rather than the focus being on getting people back into exercise, capture the enjoyment of physical activity and have structures that maintain that, rather than losing it, so it's not a deficit position. But I will have some questions from the Zoom chat, and Elsa, who is monitoring, is going to ask it on the respondents' behalf.
Thank you. Your mention of menopause got me wondering about under-research areas in this field. I'm not saying menopause is under-researched because I don't know. Perhaps you could comment on that and other aspects in the field that are important but neglected.
So sorry, I didn't catch the first bit because you've got your mask on, and I have to say my hearing is not very good. So
sorry. Your mention of menopause got me wondering about under-researched areas in this field. I'm not saying menopause is under-researched because I don't know. Perhaps you could comment on that and other aspects in the field that are important but neglected.
Well, I mean, the menopause is under-researched. We, first of all, you know, we know about many women who have been struggling to get support for their menopause, so the scientific research needs to continue improving in this area. But even from a sociological perspective, and also from a historical perspective, I think we need to find out a lot more about women's experiences. But at the same time, what I think worries me about what's going on in the menopause chat or narrative at the moment is that a lot of women are now subjecting themselves to biomedical regulation and engaging in biological reductionism by reinterpreting their experiences primarily through the lens of the menopause. So I think that needs to be addressed, actually, trying to think of different ways that we can make sense of that experience. Other areas of research, I have to say I'm stumped now. I'm not having the presence of mind. I'm sorry, but somebody might say something that will set me off.
Well, I was struck by your comment about the mind-body duality and thinking about physical activity and something like yoga, which seeks to address, you know, an element of physical activity, but very much within a practice, which is about your mental being and the way you are in the world through your practice of yoga. And I wondered if that was, you know, those sorts of physical activities give you a different, you know, potentially a different lens.
Yes, undoubtedly. And I mean, there has been quite a bit of work on yoga, and now, of course, Pilates has taken off. So what's coming out of the evidence at the moment is that these practices are actually experiencing an increase in take-up, especially amongst women. So we need to find out more about the extent to which, yes, the women are able to reconnect and with their bodies, not just as necessarily sexualized bodies or as aestheticized bodies, but as bodies that the women feel pleasure in.
Yeah.
And I think that I think is really important, because at the moment it's too much about either health or weight loss or, you know, fulfilling particular norms of physicality, which the women don't necessarily control.
Certainly, from my personal perspective, the way to cure my interest in running was to finish a marathon. And after I finished the running, you cross the finishing line. That was it. That's it. I've not run again for a bus even. So, an interesting. Yes. We also had a question about the cultural origin impact on the role of social relationships and how people cope with physicality and aging. So you mentioned gender and class being really important elements of engaging and being in your body, and you're not problematizing aging. But I wondered if anything that you've either researched yourself or are interested in researching is about that cultural origin and how that impacts, so not only gender and class.
Oh, you mean like race and ethnicity?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yes, so I don't do research in this area myself, although I have talked to one of my colleagues here at GCU. It's just, I don't know when I'll find the time, but we need to decolonize physical activity research. So we need to do research in this area, which is not just about how can we, you know, the problem with Black or ethnic minority people is that they don't engage in physical activity in the same way that we might do this with women or older adults. So I think we really need to do some work which seeks to understand not just processes of exclusion, which undoubtedly happen. I talked about some older adults feeling like fish out of water, in particular sports settings, and this undoubtedly happens for people from non-white people, particularly in white-centric countries. But we also need to understand what the people's orientation to their physicality.
Yeah.
You know, so that we don't necessarily apply biomedicalized standards of physicality onto to people.
Yeah. So, Emanuelle, we're coming to the end, and just in wrapping up, I was struck by a large number of P's in your presentation. Physicality, which is a P. The practice of freedom, which I love the idea of the practice of freedom about having your body, and something that I hadn't thought about until today. The performative aspect, not only of you here today, but actually of our being in our body, whether it's by sport or physical exercise, permissions that we give each other and others to be in our body, policy choices and processes. So a load of P's, but we've thoroughly enjoyed. I hope that those of you on the Zoom have been able to chat and contribute to some discussion. Certainly those of us here today have thoroughly enjoyed it. And we will also have the benefit of a small gathering outside to wish you well. But on behalf of everybody here today, thank you so much, Emanuelle. Thank you.